Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here, having worked with you for a couple of years now, particularly with Jeff and John. The topic of this presentation is really about what the world-class finance functions are doing that is different from the other functions which aren't world-class to enable global growth. And so unsurprisingly, I will refer to the term world-class quite a few times in this presentation. And before we get into the meat of it, I'd like to just remind ourselves of the definition of world-class. Hackett defined world-class empirically. It is a well-established position of performance which characterizes organizations that are in the top quartile of efficiency and effectiveness for a particular function or process. And you will hear me refer to the other organizations which aren't world-class, and I will use the term peer group, so meaning those organizations which do not achieve typically top quartile performance in efficiency and effectiveness. So the relevance of this is that one of the objectives that I'd like to achieve after this some 40 minutes that you're kindly giving me is that every one of us can leave this room with an understanding of the key differentiators of what makes some finance functions operate with high degrees of efficiency and effectiveness, whereas others are lagging behind. And hopefully, as we are going through this slide, you will recognize some of the changes that you yourselves, Rolls Royce, are seeking to implement to both improve the efficiency and the effectiveness of the finance function. So let me just start with a reflection on what we've seen globally in the last couple of years. It will come as no surprise to you that the successive crisis, increase in volatility and price of commodities, and even the recent disasters which have affected major economies like Japan have impacted adversely the global enterprise. And as a result of this, of course, everyone else, every function in enterprises like Rolls-Royce is also being impacted. When we look at finance specifically and we ask CFOs what their priorities are, well, largely they come up with a dual agenda. That on the one side, holding the cost line, both for the business in its entirety, but also for their own functions, bearing in mind that they need to obviously be seen as being good citizens and do what they preach to others, as well as enabling better decisions, a decision to basically sustain performance and increase value over time. Now, this is basically showing in those themes of initiatives that you see on the left, on the left-hand side. The slide I prefer, which makes it a bit more concrete, is the next one, which look at it on a process-by-process basis. What we're seeing here is that the dual agendas of holding the cost line and improving the value of the finance function really translate in priorities for transformation. And so, unsurprisingly, what we're seeing is that quite a lot of the improvement are directed at what we call the enterprise performance management processes of organizations like Rolls-Royce, so the planning, the forecasting, the reporting and analysis. And it's no surprise because, quite frankly, most of the decisions that will ultimately impact performance, for better or worse, are those that are made or not made, as the case may be, as part of those cycles. So if you think about the decision to acquire, move to different markets, sweat some of the assets, these are typically key decisions that play a part in your planning and forecasting process. And of course, there is still an agenda there to aim for operational excellence, be better at transacting, but in the main, the value and therefore the investment is directed up there. Unfortunately, whilst we start seeing glimpses of a recovery, for instance, by looking at the revenue increase that we've seen, particularly over the last years as compared to prior years. What we're also seeing is that largely this recovery is jobless. So what it means is that although companies are actually improving their top line, they're not about to hire massively or even entertain the idea that back office function, like finance, should have a higher cost than they used to have. And that obviously translates in doing more with less. Okay? And it's just a fact. It impacts finance, it impacts IT, it impacts procurement. And sometimes when I work in organizations, it seems that it's a bit of an impossible task, right? How can you possibly suddenly fundamentally transform your service delivery model, do more with less? And there are many, many reasons why you could see that external pressures are actually driving workload up and hindering the capability of finance function to adapt. And yet, what we've proven time and time again with about 2 decades worth of data is that there are invariably a broad range of business practices, best practices, that correlates to greater performance, both in terms of efficiency and effectiveness, that are absolutely within the gift of finance to implement, and yet are invariably not implemented on a consistent basis globally. So we're talking about best practices that relate to how the decisions that impact process design are made. For example, the idea of global process ownership, having accountable individuals globally making decisions that impact policies that will then drive standardization further down the line. Unsurprisingly, we're talking about best practices that relates to data governance, which ultimately will impact and either help or hinder the ability of the organization and the finance function to analyze its business. Best practice that relates to the integration of the planning cycle, both logically between strategic planning, midterm operating planning, forecasting, as well as physically, essentially having systems that talk to each other. So there remains the question, what is it that the work class do that is different, that enable them to essentially scale better and therefore help achieve the growth agenda, which characterize, by the way, most of the enterprise-wide strategy for global firms like yours. And our research shows that there are actually 3 key differentiators that world-class organizations in general are going for that other organizations don't really pursue as actively and as holistically as the world class. The first one is this notion of global leverage. Global leverage is really the ability to deploy on a global scale standardization for a large cross-section of processes, obviously transactional, but also knowledge-based processes, to get the dual benefits of clearly labor arbitrage benefits from working offshore often, but also some benefits in terms of quality of service, which is a byproduct of standardization, particularly in the areas of knowledge-based services. The other key cluster of best practice, as it were, is about better, broader information. Now, this is really about re-looking at how finance adds value, what is the information that the finance function should provide to the rest of the business to enable better decisions, and then both rationalizing and realigning that information. And again, we are going to explore a few myths versus realities in that space in a moment. Finally, this notion of agile execution. Agile execution in this case really is about creating service delivery models, to John's point, which are able to help the finance function manage both the demand and the supply for their services. which is a key, basically, differentiators of the world class.